Hello, and I want to say I'm very pleased to be here, to see so many interested faces. And I want to thank Annie Polland and Laura Lee, her assistant way in the back, for organizing this event tonight. I'm not going to talk for very long. I'm supposed to give a sort of a biography of the book, of my father, and sort of the history of the book, which I will do briefly. Today I had the opportunity to come and visit, have a tour of the Tenement Museum, something that's been long on the list of family places to visit when we come to New York. And I'm really glad that I did, because it was a really enlightening experience and very interesting. It gave me much more of a sort of physical sense of the kind of immigrant experience that my father would have had as a child growing up in New York City in a heavily Jewish and immigrant neighborhood, although he grew up in the Bronx, not this part of New York. He was born in New York City in 1920, but his parents had immigrated from Russia, from the area of the Pale, now my father said was probably called near Moldova, so it's that part of the world. And his parents, like many immigrants, I suppose, came for a better life in about 1912. The story that I heard was that they came on the same boat but didn't know each other, and only later met and got married. But I think that they brought with them the desire for a better life, like many immigrants who come to this country do, as well as the Jewish tradition of education, culture, learning, although I have to say they were very much secular Jews and not religious Jews. Probably not a surprise if you know anything about my father's writing. But clearly my father had a thirst, I know, for learning, and he was a very bright young man. He skipped 2 grades in school so that he entered City College by the time he was 16, which is pretty young. Now, I know there's some pictures, but I don't know how to, I have to say, I should have asked beforehand. Okay. Okay, here's what I know of as being the earliest picture of him that I know. It looks to me like he's on a farm. He's wearing short pants, so I don't know, maybe he was sent to summer camp or something. Anyway, so the next picture is also of that value of culture and learning. Well, he was a violin player, apparently. I have to say, I never heard him play. I think he gave it up at some point, but he had that tradition of, and once again, he's in short pants, so how old could he have been? Maybe 12? I don't know, 13 at most. So he went to City College, and here is a picture of him, his graduation picture, looking very serious. I know that he's written a lot about his experiences of at City College, particularly arguing the political world of the time. I suspect he spent more time in the cafeteria arguing politics than he did in the classroom. But anyway, he did graduate. But this drive to learn, to know, to understand, to analyze, to think, to write was clearly, I think, for my father, I don't have to say I think, I know, was a lifelong passion, and helped him become the public intellectual that he did become. The corpus of his writing is quite extensive, and really presented for us a challenge in putting together the book. So editing the book was for me a really wonderful personal experience. A journey, I would say, because it gave me an opportunity to learn more about the public and the intellectual side of my father, with some more hints about the personal, and I'll come back to that idea of the personal in a minute. It's a journey I also shared with a number of other people, and in particular, I have to acknowledge my son, Nicholas, who was my trusty and deeply engaged assistant, and I really could not have done the job without him, and it gave us a time to really bond and be together in a really interesting and wonderful way. So together we read through many pieces and discussed and made decisions, and then when Yale came back and said, but you have to cut out X number of pages, oh no. So we had to make more decisions. But where did the journey start? Well, the journey really started, I have to say, with Alana, my father's widow, who made a comment to me, remarked one day, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, you know, the 20th anniversary of your father's death is coming up in 2013, and it's time to get some of his pieces back into print. Come on, let's do something. And I kind of went, yeah, okay, yes, I know. Not that I don't have a million other things to do, but she really encouraged me to do that, and I have to say I have to thank her for that encouragement. And it seemed, like a fine idea to go back and look at his work and try to put together a selection. There was another reason that sort of prompted this, feeling that maybe this was the right time, because of what we call in the family the Irving Howe sightings. Friends and family and people would send me letters and emails, and we'd find sightings to Irving Howe in all kinds in the press and the public press and other kinds of serious work. And so it seemed that Dad's ideas were still popping up and important to people. So we thought this was another reason. In fact, I have to say, just last week I got a very engaging email from a man by the name of Judge Rothenberg, who is a member of the Florida State Judiciary, who said to me that he had been been a judge for 33 years, but one of his most prized possessions was a copy of World of Our Fathers. But it's falling apart. And why is it not an e-book? And he's also saying to me, I'm having trouble reading the print. I won't make any comments about blind justice here, but so he had tracked me down because he had contacted the publisher. And the publisher put him in contact with me, and so he's now mounting a campaign to get it into an e-book. So we'll see if he's successful. I certainly hope so. Anyway, in terms of the book, eventually I did get organized, and I reached out to some other people to help because, the corpus of my father's writing goes on for 45, 50 years. It's an awful lot to cover. So I want to thank, in particular, 3 people, David Bromwich, Mark Levinson, and Brian Morton, who each produce lists of possible selections for the book. Sometimes they agreed, sometimes they disagreed. We had a kind of a very engaging email exchange, series of emails to try to pare down what would be reasonable. As well, I have to thank Alana, my husband, my daughter Anna, for their suggestions. And there were some other people at Yale that really helped promote the book, the editor, Eric Brandt, and Alden Farrow, who's been the PR media person who's been great to work with. So I thank them all. So we have this quite long list of possible selections. And Nick and I literally read through everything. And it was a very enlightening process, partly for me because, of course, in the 50s and 60s, I was a child. I wasn't reading my father's work. And so it gave me a much more of a chronological view of his ideas and what kinds of issues that he was thinking about. It gave me an opportunity to appreciate his fine mind, his sense of humor, and his insightful ideas about politics, literature, and the world, and the interconnections between all of those themes. And when it came down to selecting the pieces, I picked a few pieces that, for me, were personally important or meaningful. Sometimes they were book reviews of books that my father had recommended that I read. The selection in the book is just that. It's a selection, and it's a small selection that we arranged by decade, because that's the method my father had used in his previous collections of writing. Each of the decades includes a major political piece, longer essays, usually of a literary nature, book reviews. But we also wanted to acknowledge his importance in promoting Yiddish literature, and of course his long time editorship of Dissent. My father wrote extensively about 3 major issues: social political criticism, literary criticism, and Jewish history. And I'd like to say one of those topics would probably have been enough for any of the rest of us, but he crossed all of them. And I've tried to understand, what is common among those 3 themes. And I think part of it comes down, the common thread that comes to my mind is his interest in the common man, whether it's the common reader or the immigrant trying to understand the life of the immigrant adjusting to life in New York, which he certainly personally experienced. And wrote about, obviously, in World of Our Fathers. My father was a public intellectual, certainly, but he was actually a rather private person. And he didn't talk much, really, about his childhood or his experiences growing up in New York, in the Bronx, and unfortunately, he never wrote that family memoir that he had promised just for the family, so I really have not a lot of knowledge about that. But I do think that in some of his writings there are hints of the autobiographical. There are some sections of World of Our Fathers which I take to be heavily autobiographical. And in the book, there's a piece called Strangers, which I think also includes some interesting autobiographical information. And he talks about how does the poor immigrant Jewish college boy struggle to come to terms with American literature? How does he come to understand authors like Emerson and Thoreau, who had a life experience that was so different than his own? Well, I think in closing, I'd like to say I believe that my father had the imagination and the intellectual capacity to overcome these struggles and to create a rich and passionate life for himself and for the readers of his work. And let me just show you the rest of the pictures here, which are actually in the book. Here's a picture in about 1954 of myself standing up and my brother. This picture was taken at Stanford. He spent 2 years working in the institute at Stanford, hating every minute of it, I'm sure. He was not a Californian. He was a New Yorker born and bred, so he didn't, but this, I think, is a great picture. And finally, that's the picture that's on the cover that was taken for World of Our Fathers, which captures him, I think, in a really warm and wonderful way. So thank you very much.
I did not grow up in New York. I grew up in Milwaukee. And one of the things I noticed in high school, I think I was in my home, and then I was in my grandparents' home, and different people, I noticed that every American Jewish home had a copy of A World of Our Fathers, even more so than the Bible. I started to kind of track it, which I think would probably make him happy on some level. But I started by talking about why I thought this was a nice setting to host this event, basing it on World of Our Fathers. And of course, what we do at the Tenement Museum is we tell the immigrant experience of a variety of immigrant groups, and of which the East European Jewish experience is one of those, and very important. But on another level, I wanted to show this very brief clip, I think it's just 1 minute or 2 minutes, from a CUNY television interview from the early 1970s, in which I think he speaks to the importance of history in advancing progressive causes, which is what I think a lot of the educators who work here at this museum, and many of the, not just the educators, but many people who work at this museum, try to think of how history can be used to at least open up the complexities and get people thinking in new ways. So I'm just going to show this very quick clip.
Can you be a radical and still maintain an optimism about the future?
Well, by radical, I don't mean the thing which, the popular press envisages, or perhaps a lot of people share in their fantasies. I mean by radical a desire to see deep-going social changes of a democratic and egalitarian kind in American society within the structure of American democracy. Can one be an optimist about this? Well, I'm old enough now to remember a time when people thought that Social Security, unemployment insurance, and old age pensions were the most confounded, outrageous notions imported from Moscow, etc., etc. And now what strikes me is that many of our kids take these things so completely for granted that one has to explain to them that there was a time when people thought politically, through trade unions, through parties, that you had to go out and fight for these things. Well, that's, I suppose, a sign of progress, though it also can irritate you in some ways. And
there are still people who are opposed to those changes.
Right. And now, for example, if we say we believe that the corporations should be democratically run, that workers and corporations should have a say in their own fate, and that the public should have a say in what happens with the corporations, or corporations, things like that. This strikes some people as preposterous, and yet it's entirely possible 30, 40 years from now it will, at least in part, have become an element in our political experience. What about...
So maybe another 30 or 40 years, but I'd like to invite Tony and Paul and Nina and Sarah to at the table to begin their conversation.
Thank you, Annie, for inviting us to convene. I just want to say I discovered Irving Howe and Dissent magazine when I was in college in Santa Cruz, pretty as far away from the Bronx, I guess you can get in the continental U.S. And I became a subscriber very, very quickly. I still am a subscriber, and really Irving Howe gave me and Dissent together. They were inseparable. To me, gave me an orientation politically and intellectually that still shapes me, the kind of research I do, politics and so on. So this means a lot to me to be able to participate with Sarah, Nina, and Paul. So I'll start off, and so what we'll do is I have some questions, but this was going to be really a conversation, not a series of interviews. And no one has heard the questions in advance. It's just going to be a spontaneous conversation. And I want to start by picking up on something Nina said regarding the selection process and how difficult it was to make choices, especially considering his body of work is tremendous. But you mentioned that you organized this chronologically, but I noticed one decade was not here, and that's the 1940s. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, why that decade's not represented here.
That's a good question. I don't really think although I know my father was writing at the time, I don't think that much of it is, I guess there are two reasons. One, in his own collections of work, he never included anything from that period. And I think he probably felt that that was a time when he was still young, still developing his style, his ideas, and that this was not yet time for him to put it into his own collections. So I know that there are some pieces from that period. I think also a lot of it was not published. Maybe some of it was anonymous or whatever. It was published without a byline. I also know that he was also paying the bills by writing book reviews, anonymous book reviews for Time magazine in the late 40s, early 50s. So that's a good question. But
Still too undeveloped.
Yeah, I think he was just feeling probably his work was not yet developed. So.
All right, so Paul and Sarah, I have a question for the two of you. Coming from different generations, how did you encounter Irving Howe? What point in your life, not necessarily personally, but as writers, activists, and so forth, how did you encounter him? How did you perceive him as an intellectual? Maybe it makes sense for Paul to start with that.
I encountered Irving Howe in the 1970s because I had come up in the New Left of the 60s and early 70s, which was a student movement that during my period in it wanted nothing to do with the older generation, and nothing to do with the old history of the left, and nothing to do with the older intellectuals, until our movement collapsed. And then our movement collapsed totally. And at that point, a tremendous passion overcame a large number of people to meet the older generation and figure out, if there was something to be learned from them, and to connect in some way. So I began to look at Dissent magazine, and I realized that Dissent magazine was in very bad odor, in certain parts of the New Left, and I wondered why. And I began to read it, and I couldn't find a reason why, and I began to think it was excellent. At the same time, I was trying to learn how to write myself, and the way to learn how to write is to find some master who you think is great, and imitate that person, and I found I was trying to imitate Irving Howe, because whoever that was, I thought he was a great writer of book reviews, and he has a masterful prose which is light and cutting, and he has a great way of shaping pieces. So I began to write my own book reviews and eventually worked up the courage to send one to him at Dissent, although I had no contact with anybody at Dissent. And I reviewed a book on Spanish anarchism, sent it to Irving, and he wrote back instantly saying he did not want this piece at all. But he found something of interest, and perhaps I could propose some other things. That's the beginning of the story.
I want to go back to your comment on the prose. I'm going to quote something you wrote, actually, in 1993, after Howe passed away. It's not the whole passage, but maybe this is enough to get you to say a little bit more. You wrote that Howe's prose captured, quote, the immigrant pathos in a way that manages to remain light in the lightness that manages to be sorrowful. Do you have any recollection? Maybe it's unfair for me to dredge this up, but you did use the word light just a few seconds ago. So I am going to dredge it up. And could you elaborate on that thought in retrospect, or if not, improvise?
Yeah, I'll have to improvise. I don't remember where that... Was that in print?
That was in Dissent. That was in Dissent as part of a number of tributes to him after he passed away.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's fashionable in some quarters to say that Irving has a wooden or academic prose style, which I think is just completely an error. That there's, as with any writer, he has his better moments and his flatter moments, but his better moments are many, and they're very rich in musical possibilities. So. He does have a lightness and a sweetness. There's a reason why I think he was best in short bursts. And one of the reasons why World of Our Fathers is such a great masterpiece is that he figured out that it should be written in short bursts. And each of those bursts manages somehow to float. And the floating is partly a humor. It's partly what you see in that book is a great tenderness. He feels just an easy, sympathetic tenderness for the poor immigrants whom he is writing about in that book. And then at the same time, Irving is always some aspect of him is anti-sentimental, so there's always something in him that wants to stab a knife into what is becoming a little too flabby or fatty, and so the combination of the humor, the knife jabs, the tenderness, all in a style that also is just perfectly unpretentious. I think the fact that he has a wonderful style and is said by some people not to have a wonderful style is the most beautiful testament to the perfection of his style, because the style that he is striving for is one that you're not supposed to notice. You're supposed to put the essay or the book down as saying to yourself, that was very interesting. I enjoyed it. I'd like to read something else by this author. But you're not supposed to notice the style. And so a lot of foolish people do not notice the style, and they think it's not a good style, but it's a great style.
Sarah, I'm really curious to hear your answer. You know, I went to a Dissent holiday party in 2005, I think it was, and there weren't that many people there. It was fairly well attended, but then I went about 5 years ago, and it was really well attended, and there were a lot of young people there. And I noticed your name at some point along the line became associated with the magazine, and I was curious about this. When I was in college, as I alluded to, no one I know read Dissent magazine. Santa Cruz is a very left-wing place, but it's a very flaky place too, and probably had a lot of ideas that would have made Howe cringe. If he disliked Stanford, he would have hated Santa Cruz. And so there's all this left-wing activism, but nothing related to the kind of politics of dissent, which is why I love Dissent magazine. So this is, I'm really curious to know why you were attracted to it and how you became involved.
Well, I sort of stumbled into it when I was still a college student. I was attending college within walking distance of the office, which at the time was a studio apartment on the Upper West Side, where we all sat within like 3 inches of each other. I mean, the staff made very good friends that way. And at the time, I was not well versed in the left, really. I had grown up a Democrat, a big D Democrat, among liberals, and those were my politics. And at some point, as people do in college, I realized that my politics were unsatisfactory. I didn't think they explained very much. They were unsatisfying. And I sort of went looking. And to find at that time socialism in the US that was not a sectarian handing you a newspaper, it's very difficult. But I found Dissent. And so I interned there. And so I was basically working part-time in the office. And I, of course, did not get to meet Irving Howe, but he was very much a presence in the office, and people would just refer to Irving, like things Irving had said, or things that Irving did or wrote, always on a first-name basis. And so you sort of got to know Irving Howe that way. The famous postcards he would send people with very few words on them, but exactly the right words or the most cutting words, or the words that told you that you could publish in Dissent, were discussed, and people saved them. And so to sort of address how so many young people ended up at the holiday party, this was at a time when also many new little magazines were getting off the ground, so things like New Inquiry and Jacobin, which now have a bit of a readership and were able to take off largely because of the internet, but were quite radical. And so there was a growing community of young people around those, and a lot of the people who thought about those magazines modeled them in a broad way on Dissent and would say so. How to have a little magazine that was intellectually engaged and interesting, not a big glossy that you had to spend a huge amount of money to put out, committed to ideas. And so there was sort of a growing milieu of these people who found each other through a number of different magazines and also understood what Dissent was or learned. And because I was working at Dissent and these places, I was able to enjoy a lot of that interchange and, invite people to the holiday party as well. But people really were, many people had read some piece somewhere from Dissent or had some idea of Dissent as this intellectual space. And yeah, so especially with Occupy and so forth, there's been a sort of growing young left intellectual scene, and that owes something to Dissent.
I might return to that at a later point, but I wanted to ask Nina a question. Did you come across any discoveries? Did you come to see your father differently in any way through this process of reading and collecting his articles for publication?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think that I did, in the sense that when I first started to read some of these pieces, initially I had thought that maybe in terms of organizing the book, there would be sort of political pieces and then literary pieces. And what really struck me in reading through all of this is how intermingled his literary and his political ideas were. And that to think that one could separate them into the political pieces and the literary pieces was just not going to fly. It just didn't make any sense. And in retrospect, I mean, he did write a book called Politics in the Novel, which maybe I was a little naive to think that one could do that. But it just gave me such a breadth, it's such a view that he had such a breadth of ideas and approaches, and it was so open to so many different kinds of things that, and struggling to understand, what were people thinking about, whether it was the Jewish immigrant or the, reading some of his, some of the pieces that I really loved came from the Critic's Notebook, which is his last book, which was published posthumously, where he had decided to write some ideas about literature, short little pieces, and they're like little jewels. And, did Anna Karenina, did she have to die, for example, which is one that we kept included in the book. He writes about Dostoevsky, and he writes about Dickens, and just I knew that he had a great love for 19th and 20th century European and American and Russian literature, but it really came through very, very strongly for me. And it sort of pulled a lot of things together for me.
Did you include that very moving portion of his autobiography, A Margin of Hope, where he discusses his relationship with his father? Have you been tempted to write about your relationship with your father?
Well, this is probably as close as I'm ever going to get to it. Let's put it that way. My father was, although he's a very public person, he was a private person, and he didn't share a lot of his. Only in his later years did we develop a closer relationship where he began to tell me things about his childhood, his family, and there's many things I don't know, and I wish I did know. But essentially, he was a private person, and I respect that for him. So I don't know that I would particularly write about our relationship, although it was very close and warm and loving, and I miss him a great deal.
Dissent seems to me, in a lot of Irving Howe's best writings, are the product of someone who's thought through the problems of an earlier political orientation and tried to build Marxism in his case, and then tried to take out what's best there in radicalism and go forward with it. I think for that reason, Dissent has always had a problem, let's say a generational problem, which is to say young people who are just starting out, I think, have tended to find this will be coming back to some of your comments, have founded the magazine. They wouldn't put it this way, but maybe too reflective, too thoughtful, too maybe a little too cautious. In other words, in Dissent, there's an awareness always that socialism is a problem. It's an inspiration, but it's a problem too. And that, I think, to appeal to someone, you have had to have gone through an experience where you feel that. And usually 18-year-olds or 16-year-olds or 19-year-olds don't feel that. So I want to go back to your comment, your experience. Jacobin, for instance, has a different tone than Dissent. So can you give a sense of what among this emerging or already emerged generation of radicals and intellectuals is like when you talk about Dissent, or the ideas? Let's say you can even separate this a bit from Dissent. Let's say the orientation of Dissent, the kind of democratic socialism or social democratic politics, again, this awareness that you need radical social change, but social change is a problem, and it brings with how does this play out among your peers? And what are the conversations like? Because to be honest with you, I was reading Jacobin a few days ago, and I can imagine quite a sneer coming from the editors when you talk about. There's a quote from Lincoln Steffens on the masthead online that says, "I've seen the future and it works." Well, that was about the Soviet Union. And so maybe the editors were being a little funny or humorous or kind of ironic here, but still. So can you give? Now the point is here. My question is not to pick on Jacobin, but to try and gain a sense of what the conversations are like among young radicals who are looking at Dissent as in some way a kind of predecessor.
That's a wonderful question. I think. So a place like Jacobin has, or a magazine like Jacobin has been started at a sort of historical moment where much of its skewing pretty young audience is post 89, right? So there are not the same gut reactions to the idea of socialism. You can make that Lincoln Steffens sort of reference without it feeling like sort of taboo. And I think that their take, which I think makes lots of sense, though it is different from Dissent's, is that because we need to build confidence on the left at this point in history, since the left is very small, since the left is certainly not at risk of executing any unfortunate policies, given the left lacks power completely, a sort of confidence-building project in the left's past and the left's current attitudes is actually more productive than the sort of troubled and contemplative thinking about socialism for which Dissent is known. And I'm not sure, I mean, all kinds of different people write for that magazine. I think many of them would be sympathetic with Dissent's positions. There's lots of crossover between writers. They're not separate, but the tone of that magazine is different for a reason that I think makes lots of sense. Dissent Dissent just is not interested in that sort of flip attitude, right? Even if it's for some strategic purpose. Dissent wants its articles to authentically argue what they're arguing and take account of the problems with it. It's certainly not a confidence-building project. It's called Dissent. And there's something very elegant about that and honorable that I have a lot of respect for. I do think that it's less. Sometimes it's that Dissent is cautious, but I think it's less that than Dissent considers certain lessons to have been learned, and they're very specific lessons about what's good and bad on the left. And if something seems to be running against that grain, then it's not really making it in the magazine. And that is, we could talk about what those things are. I mean, they would certainly include revolutionary violence. So if something is running against that, it's not going to make it in the magazine. That's the filter. That being said, one of my favorite memories from Dissent was going down to Zuccotti Park with Michael Walzer, who was the editor at the time, now emeritus, and sort of walking around. And these are not Michael's politics or Irving Howe's politics. This was a sort of quasi-anarchist gathering in a park with actually no coherent politics in many ways. But Michael wanted to see it, and he was delighted. He was happy that people were doing something. He was happy young people were doing something. And there was a lot of interest. I mean, at the magazine, the attitude was interest. It wasn't condemnation or even a lot of criticism at first.
Paul, do you want to comment?
Okay.
Unfortunately, I haven't read enough of Jacobin to comment on it. But I've read a little bit, and the most recent piece I read was a criticism of Michael Walzer's brilliant new book, The Paradox of Liberation. I found the criticism just infuriating, outrageous, the sort of thing that Dissent was founded to condemn. And so I have many complicated thoughts on Tony's question and Sarah's response. I think that there's a reason why Irving himself didn't keep in print his writings from the 40s, and why they haven't attained an immortal life in anthologies. And that's because the whole rest of his life was lived in rejection of and contemplation of and rueful contemplation of his life in the 1940s. Because in the 40s, he was active in the Workers' Party, in the old Shachtmanite thing, which was a real Marxist party and also a sect. And he eventually had to discover that Marxism itself was too wooden and the life of the sect was too constricting by far, and he rebelled against it. And the whole essence, I think, of what's interesting about Irving's political thinking is contained in that rejection. It's a sophisticated rejection. He does not reject. He never rejects the broad idealistic impulses that drew him into this movement. He's for those. I'm convinced that if Irving had lived long enough to see Occupy Wall Street, he would fundamentally have liked it. He would have been worried. It's not for me to speak for his ghost, but I'm not surprised that Walzer responded well to it too, because there in Occupy you could see the an outrage against economic injustice, an outrage against just the grotesque disequalities of power and wealth that brought on the financial crisis in 2008, and you could see a rebellion against it, which was a rebellion that was admirable in every single way, except perhaps that it was unable to go further than it did and to generate something. But in itself, it was an admirable thing. What Irving was worried about was what people, in his own experience, had drawn from that kind of idealistic feeling of social protest, which was a life of the Leninist sects, the wooden ideology, and all the rest of that. So he turned against that, but he was I interpret him to have been in a lifelong struggle over that, trying to separate out what always seemed to him admirable from what was unfortunate. And then he ends up, I think, to me, in my reading, the room is full of people who can quarrel with me on this, but he ends up with an interpretation of the left and of the American left, which is very appealing. It's a little bit irritating. It's a little bit his interpretation. It's a little bit depressing, but it's also very appealing and has the quality of being able to continue to live, which is why we continue to speak about him. And that's this. He understands that the American left has drawn on these completely admirable impulses, and yet has run into all kinds of failures, and then sometimes failures that are worse than failures, that were some corners of the left have turned into something really deplorable, and he draws from some of this a pessimistic view, which I don't share. I was once at a conference in Princeton for the 100th anniversary of the birth of Norman Thomas, where Irving and Michael Harrington were practically in tears over the dreadful thing that had been the New Deal, because the New Deal back in the 1930s, while from some point of view was a tremendous social advance, from another point of view was just the death of the Socialist Party, and it was too bad, and they were overcome with gloom. This wasn't their only attitude toward it, but in one of their moods they were very gloomy about it, and I found that annoying. Why weren't they more filled with vigor and hope over it? But this kind of gloomy and pessimistic view allows Irving, I speak in the present tense because I'm speaking about his writings, which live. They allow Irving to look back over the whole of the history and ruefully acknowledge, yes, there have been defeats, there have been tremendous errors, and yet there's a nobility in some of these defeats. There's a nobility in the fundamental idea, and especially there's a nobility in the the saving remnant who in each period are carrying forward the real fundamental idea of the left, the real idealistic commitment to social protest, and the real vision of what sort of better society could be brought into existence. He's always very clear on this. So, and you see it in his book on socialism in America, and you see it in his book on his biographical essay on Leon Trotsky, and you see it in a lot of things. It seems to me this is a vision because it's a little melancholy and rueful and sometimes a little annoying. It's not a vision for very young people. When I saw a lot of very young people coming to dissent parties, I thought this is sort of good, but sort of a mistake. That and everyone will figure out eventually that it's a mistake. The political heritage, intellectual heritage of Irving Howe is a little bit too melancholy and complex to be a young person's, but it's just the right amount of melancholy and complex and perplexed to have an enduring quality that lives forever.
I don't know about that the young people at Dissent were a mistake. My father talked about that in his last years, about how he was so taken with the fact that there were young people who aren't so young anymore, but at the time, that was, but who were part of Dissent, and that the fact that it wasn't just a bunch of old folks still writing for Dissent, but that there were young people, and I know that he would be delighted with the young people that are working there, and that it's still going and so lively and has gained a new impetus in the last few years online and things like that. So, which I'm sure he never would have understood. You know, he refused to use a computer. He was an electric typewriter man till the end. So,
let's open it up for questions and oh.
Tony, you've done such a good job asking others, but I wanted to, as a historian of the American Jews, if you wanted to respond to, I think, was it in 2000 and it must have been 2006, where the journal American Jewish History came out with several 6 or 7 historians putting their take on World of Our Fathers. And I know you wrote in that volume, and I'm wondering if you could speak to the kind of the effect that World of Our Fathers has had on the field of American Jewish history and your personal take as well.
So it was actually 2001. It was on the anniversary, it must have been the 25th anniversary of World of Our Fathers. And I should just say World of Our Fathers was his best-selling book. It sold the most copies. It won the... I'm sure it was the only best-selling book. It was the only best-selling book. It won the National Book Award. And according to his autobiography, it gave him some financial security. So this was it was a monument in its own right, but also, I think, an important book in his life. And it was one of the first books I read in American Jewish history as an undergraduate, and I guess, I'm sure, drew me towards that field. Someone who I was hoping was going to be here tonight, named Danny Sawyer, co-edited, actually it was his inspiration to do this special issue to reassess World of Our Fathers. And Danny was the perfect guy to do it, I should say, because of his family background in the old left. His grandfather was a well-known artist and associated with the Communist Party, and he had been a member of Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee in the 70s, this ancient history, but he went through Dissent. So anyway, he was connected to this book, World of Our Fathers. So he invited a number of us to contribute. Morris Dickstein, in the introduction to this book, refers to the issue of American Jewish history and says it didn't treat the book very kindly. And Dickstein's right, actually. The editor, Danny Sawyer, loved the book, but most of the contributors were critical in some way. And in my view, these criticisms were pretty small-minded. I don't mind saying. So one of them was, we're the Orthodox Jews. We're the Zionists. Who's been left out? There's not, and so that was one criticism. It's not comprehensive. It was too subjective, too shaped by Howe's politics as socialism. Right? So that was one criticism. Let's just say it's the main criticism. I won't go into. That's some of the main criticism. This has come out over the years among professional American Jewish historians and people who do this for a living, all of whom read the book and were really moved by the book when it came out in 1976. There's no doubt about that. Everyone was moved by the book. So I think I was the only one to write in defense of the book's socialist perspective on the immigrant experience. I thought it was actually an accurate perspective. And I tried to explain how his socialism shaped it in ways that were sometimes subtle and other times more overt. And I think he had it right, actually. I think that, which was this, that the labor movement and the socialist movement did not include everybody in the immigrant Jewish community, but it shaped the community. It shaped its sensibility, its outlook, its values, so that even people like his own parents, who he writes about in the autobiography, who were not socialists, but would never think to cross a picket line, that, in a way, is what he understood about the immigrant masses as a whole. Only a minority were political activists, but that minority was pretty large. It was a large minority, and they shaped the entire community. And so that was the case I made. I still believe that strongly. I actually think it's the best book. I would say it's one of the best 2 or 3 books in American Jewish history to this day. I assign it in graduate seminars. And not the whole thing. I assign what I think are the 2 best parts. One is on labor and socialism. The other part, which could stand alone as a separate book, actually, is on Yiddish culture, which is magnificent. It still stands as the best history of Yiddish culture, not of Yiddish literature, but of the larger cultural world of Yiddish-speaking intellectuals and literati. That stands, I think, unparalleled. And that's some of my thoughts about the book. I'll put it to you this way in a nutshell. The American Jewish field owes a big debt of a gratitude to that novel, but I wish it had an overriding role in shaping the direction of the field in terms of what historians think the American Jewish experience is about and the research priorities that they would form if they understood how accurate that book was. The field would look different.
I'd like to throw in a comment on this. I think, first of all, everybody should appreciate that Tony Michels has written the next book after World of Our Fathers to move the project forward, and we have every reason to be immensely grateful to Tony for doing this. First, just for what he's done in itself, but also because of this intellectual background which he's describing, which is this: we are in the midst of a huge rightward turn in American Jewish life and American Jewish thinking. And we see this in the field of Jewish studies and Jewish history, which has all been given a degree of religious inflection that would never have appeared in the past. And then the religiously minded people of today, and I don't mean to be delivering an anti-clerical speech, but but why not? Yes, the religiously minded people of today insist on looking back on the past and seeing mirror images of themselves or people whom they can imagine are their own progenitors, and they end up losing the memory of what was for a long while the governing political ideology of this very neighborhood, which was the general spirit that was embodied by Myra London and the Socialist Party of the Lower East Side, about which you can read in the works of Tony Michels and in the great immortal masterpiece World of Our Fathers. So we live at a moment when that sort of memory could be lost. Now, I realize that we're having this discussion in an institution which has been founded partly to retain an accurate historical memory, and so I say thank God for that.
Questions from the floor?
And also, I know it's a small group. Yes, if you could come up to ask your question as well, just so that we can have your voice amplified for all.
Complaints, accusations, recriminations. Doesn't have to be questions. Okay. So I want to, it ties in an earlier thread. how do you assess intellectual life today? Let me just preface it by saying the first essay in this book is a wonderful essay that appeared in Partisan Review in 1954 called This Age of Conformity. I read it a long time ago. I think it's even better than I remember it. In two ways. One, he's very critical of graduate school and, let's say, the warping effects of graduate school on critical independence. So that, that strikes me as truer today than any other time before, although I don't think graduate school is all bad. But there's that. And then there is the fact that, as Paul alluded to before, the inequalities in this country are becoming so vast. The Philistinism that he refers to in this essay has become so pervasive that I think this essay takes on a new urgency. I loved it. So my question is, going back to a discussion that started in the late 80s about whether or not there's a demise of what came to be called public intellectuals, but I think were formerly just called intellectuals. How does that look today? In other words, is independent intellectual life still going down the tubes? Is there something of a resurrection? I mean, one thing I noticed, and this is apropos of your comments, there seems to be, and I think this is a reflection of how horrible the academic job market is for new PhDs, that maybe one benefit, if I can say that without causing offense, one benefit is that it's forced young PhDs, I think, to start magazines, online magazines or print magazines, and doing other things, not going into academia. So in that way, I think, well, maybe there's actually something out of this economic crisis. There is a revival of of independent intellectual and critical activity. So that's my question. Is that accurate, or what's the intellectual scene looking like today?
Yes, I think that is partly true. There are a lot of people who were more or less told they should become as educated as possible, and it turns out there are no jobs in that. And even the process of getting a job is brutal and unpleasant and demeaning, and most people are forced to be adjuncts and travel all over the place, and it's impossible, and it's obviously an intentional plan by universities to cut costs, and it's extremely demeaning and terrible. That said, they are now writing for other places, which is nice, and they are very well educated. They have practiced writing. One of the funny sides of this has been that just from a stylistic perspective, Dissent, along with many other similar magazines, had a preference for plain speech and was very critical of people who wrote in convoluted theoretical prose. One of the funny things about a lot of people coming out of university programs, many of which are quite theory heavy, and then ending up writing for these magazines, is that the sort of common prose of these magazines has become a very theoretical language, which at first I found sort of obnoxious, and then I realized that while I was reading it and thinking, no one knows what this means, how can you write in this language that no one understands, everybody knew what it meant. I mean, it may not be, you could leverage a lot of criticisms against it that maybe it's too slippery and people think they know what it means and they don't, but the terminology was very familiar to many readers you would sort of see on Twitter talking about the article. They were not perplexed by terms that had been pulled into public writing from postmodern theory. And this was sort of intriguing and interesting, and I guess not necessarily bad. I think there has been a revival of the independent critic to a degree, but something else he refers to in that essay, and it's such a funny essay and so cutting, is he criticizes these kids who go to grad school, and they just want to be critics, full stop. Not as, it's not that they're interested in music, and part of their larger life of the mind around music is to write criticism. They want to be critics, maybe kind of anything. And he's like, what is your purpose? This is idiotic. That would take up a small amount of anyone's brain. And that is a thing you see now, where I feel like I see as an editor, where lots of people just want to be writers. That's become a thing. They're like, well, I'm a writer. I'm like, okay, well, what do you care about? They're like, ideas. I'm like, that's not a topic. Like, I don't care about your writing if that's what that's about. So the good thing about there being a bit of a political resurgence, too, is it gives some purpose to the work that I think people are putting out through these new magazines, and I hope that continues. But yes, I do sort of think we're sort of weirdly back in that position.
Okay. I have some thoughts. Is graduate school a good thing? I think in many departments it's a great thing. Engineering and biology. I think in the field of literary criticism, graduate school has been a disaster, and it's only been a disaster. And if there are any good literary critics who come out of graduate school, it's by fluke. I think in the history of American literature, all of the critics have had backgrounds that are in some way resemble Irving's, maybe a more privileged way in most cases, but in any case, a background of someone who loves literature and does a lot of reading and reads it for himself or herself and doesn't study it in school. I was glancing just now at a couple of Irving's wonderful anthologies on modern literary criticism and well, there were two on literary criticism. I'm forgetting the titles, and it occurred to me now that the very notion of someone like Irving Howe assembling an anthology on literary criticism would be nearly inconceivable today. That criticism has just been destroyed by the university thing, by the fashion for postmodern theory and all the rest of it. It may be true that some people, having adopted that language, are actually saying something intelligent beneath it. But if that's true, then that person is a genius whose genius you would see if only he or she would write in English. And so it's someone who's overcome the disadvantage of a university education. And that what you see in Irving, and this is to me his supreme greatness in my eyes, is the notion of a certain kind of intellectual that I think we have largely lost, and that's an intellectual whose fundamental interest is in literature and in politics, who doesn't think of literature and politics as utterly separate, who has an idea that this will be maybe sound a little strange, but who has an idea that the king of all the fields of study is literary criticism. And the reason why literary criticism is the king of all the fields of study is because literary criticism is the field that encompasses all the others. A proper literary critic should be able to write on everything, should be able to read any sort of book and aside from technical manuals, but read any sort of book with literary quality and be able to say something intelligent about it. So what seems to us this stupendous or inconceivable breadth that we find in Irving Howe's writings is actually the whole idea. You should be open to writings of every sort, and you should be able to bring to your response to them not the doctrines that you might learn in graduate school, but a breadth of education that is yours, and also a moral character of yours, the character that allows you to be true to your own emotional responses and allows you to respond emotionally to something in the recognition that you too, the critic, are a writer, just as much as is a novelist or a poet or some other writer about whose work ostensibly you are commenting.